Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I ask because time and place matter more than usual today. The subject we're approaching has a way of making both feel less reliable than you'd like. We're going to talk about the most unstable cosmic horror dimensions, not the alien planets or gothic underworlds that stay put when you look away from them. I mean the places in weird fiction that refuse to behave like places at all. Spaces that fold, bleed, dissolve. Zones where the ground rules of existence seem to have been written by something that never understood what ground was for. Writers have been documenting these impossible geographies for over a century now. Lovecraft sketched their angles. Hodgson watched them consume time itself. Ligotti found them hiding inside corporate org charts. And somewhere along the way, readers started noticing that the descriptions felt less like invention and more like field notes. So, here's what we're doing. We'll trace where these ideas came from, what makes a dimension genuinely unstable rather than merely strange, and why certain fictional spaces have lodged themselves so permanently in the human imagination. We'll look at the stories, the philosophy, the games and films that inherited them. And we'll ask a question that might be uncomfortable by the end. These dimensions were supposed to stay on the page. Whether they have is something you'll need to decide for yourself. There's a problem that haunted weird fiction writers in the early 20th century, and it wasn't the obvious one. They had monsters, certainly. They had cursed bloodlines and forbidden rituals, and all the machinery of Gothic inheritance. But they had a spatial problem. Their other worlds kept behaving too much like this one. When a protagonist in an 1890s horror story traveled to some distant realm, that realm tended to operate by recognizable rules. Different flora, perhaps. Strange customs among the inhabitants. But the ground stayed beneath your feet. Angles did what angles were supposed to do. You could, at least theoretically, draw a map. Howard Phillips Lovecraft found this deeply unsatisfying. In his letters, which often ran longer than his published fiction, he returned obsessively to the inadequacy of language when describing what he called the absolute outside. He wasn't interested in exotic locations. He wanted to evoke places that operated according to principles fundamentally incompatible with human perception. Not merely distant from Earth, but distant from the entire framework that makes distance a meaningful concept. The timing here matters enormously. Lovecraft began writing seriously in the years immediately following Einstein's general relativity papers, during a period when popular science magazines were breathlessly explaining that space itself could bend, that time was not a river, but a dimension, that the geometry we learned in school described only a local and contingent arrangement rather than an eternal truth. For a certain kind of imagination, this was not exciting. It was terrifying. And Lovecraft possessed exactly that kind of imagination. His 1920 story, From Beyond, introduces Crawford Tillinghast, a scientist who builds a machine that stimulates the pineal gland and allows perception of overlapping dimensional realities. The horror isn't that Tillinghast discovers another world. The horror is that he discovers we have always been surrounded, that the air we breathe is thick with entities we cannot see, that our comfortable three-dimensional existence is merely a thin slice of something vaster and more populated than we ever wanted to know. The dimension revealed isn't elsewhere. It's here, separated from us only by the limitations of our senses. By 1932, Lovecraft had pushed further. The Dreams in the Witch House gives us Walter Gilman, a mathematics student who realizes that certain geometric configurations can serve as doorways, The witch Keziah Mason, executed in Salem centuries earlier, had discovered how to walk through angles that don't exist in normal space. Gilman's university education becomes the very thing that endangers him, because he learns to perceive what should have remained hidden. The dimension he accesses isn't described coherently. It can't be. Lovecraft offers fragments, impressions, colors that shouldn't exist, and sounds that seem to originate from directions that aren't part of our directional vocabulary. But Lovecraft didn't invent this anxiety from nothing. William Hope Hodgson had gotten there first, in certain respects. His 1908 novel, The House on the Borderland, presents a manuscript supposedly found in the ruins of an old house in Ireland. The narrator describes how his dwelling sits on the boundary between dimensions, how he experiences visions of cosmic time in which the sun ages and dies and the earth freezes, how pig-like entities from some adjacent reality besiege his home. Hodgson's dimensions aren't just spatially unstable, they're temporally unstable. Time itself becomes unreliable, subject to accelerations and collapses that no clock could measure. Clark Ashton Smith, Lovecraft's correspondent and fellow contributor to Weird Tales magazine, added another element. His 1931 story, The City of the Singing Flame, describes a dimension that actively attracts beings from other realities. There's a flame, and it sings, and those who hear it feel compelled to walk into it and dissolve. Smith's contribution was this notion of dimensional seduction, of spaces that don't merely exist, but that want something from the beings who perceive them. What united these writers was a shared conviction that they weren't simply making things up. They approached their invented dimensions with the care of naturalists documenting a newly discovered ecosystem. Their letters reveal that they saw themselves as explorers rather than inventors, as though the spaces they described had some reality that preceded their descriptions. This wasn't delusion exactly. It was a deliberate creative stance, a way of generating the texture of authenticity that their fiction required. The new physics had told them that reality was stranger than common sense. They simply took that lesson further than the physicists intended. The weird fiction writers of the 20th century liked to present themselves as radical innovators, as minds breaking entirely new ground. This was, at best, a partial truth. The spaces they described had ancestors. The instability they evoked had been contemplated before, in different vocabularies, by people who weren't writing for pulp magazines. Consider the Gnostics of the 2nd and 3rd centuries. These religious movements, which flourished around the Mediterranean before Orthodox Christianity suppressed them, held a disturbing cosmological view. The material world, they taught, was not the creation of the true God. It was the botched work of a lesser being, a demiurge, who either through malice or incompetence had produced a realm of suffering and confusion. The true divine reality existed elsewhere, in a dimension called the pleroma, the fullness. Our world was a degraded copy, a dimension that shouldn't properly exist at all. The Gnostic cosmos was layered with barriers, archons, hostile powers, guarded the boundaries between realms. The human soul was a spark of the true light trapped in the false dimension of matter, yearning to return to its origin, but blocked by forces that wanted to keep it ignorant and imprisoned. This is, structurally, a cosmic horror story. The universe as commonly perceived is a lie. The truth is worse, and certain forms of forbidden knowledge might allow escape, though the attempt is dangerous. Kabbalistic mysticism, developing within Jewish tradition over subsequent centuries, offered its own dimensional cartography. The Yog-Sothoth, sometimes translated as husks or shells, were described as the remnants of failed divine creation. Before our world stabilized, other attempts had been made. These attempts shattered. Their fragments became a kind of anti-dimension, a realm of spiritual refuse populated by forces that feed on the debris of broken worlds. The Sitra Akra, the other side, existed in parallel to holy reality, and commerce with it was both possible and catastrophic. The Kabbalistic concept of Shevirat HaKelim, the breaking of the vessels, describes a primordial catastrophe in which the structures meant to contain divine light proved inadequate and shattered. Creation, in this view, is fundamentally damaged. We exist in the aftermath of a dimensional failure that scattered holy sparks into an unstable mixture of sacred and profane. The universe is still broken. Repair is possible, but incomplete. Neoplatonic philosophy, which influenced both Gnostic and Kabbalistic thought, proposed a hierarchy of emanation. The one, the ultimate principle, overflowed into successive levels of reality, each more distant from the source, each more characterized by multiplicity and change. By the time you reached the material world, you were many dimensions removed from true stability. Matter itself was barely real, a kind of dimensional sediment at the bottom of existence. Centuries later, Emanuel Swedenborg claimed direct visionary access to heavenly and hellish dimensions. His detailed descriptions, published in the 1700s, influenced William Blake and later the spiritualist movements of the 19th century. Swedenborg's other worlds weren't abstract. They had geography, inhabitants, customs. But they also had a troubling fluidity. The afterlife dimensions he described responded to the spiritual states of their inhabitants, shifting and reforming according to interior conditions. Space, in Swedenborg's visions, was psychological. This meant it was also unstable, because psychology is unstable. The spiritualist movement that swept through America and Europe in the latter half of the 19th century democratized dimensional contact. Suddenly, ordinary people in parlor rooms were supposedly communicating with beings from other planes of existence. The Theosophical Society, founded in 1875, systematized these ideas into an elaborate cosmology of astral planes, etheric bodies, and dimensional hierarchies. Their literature described how adepts could project consciousness into other realms, realms that had their own dangers and their own hostile inhabitants. Lovecraft read Theosophy. He didn't believe it, but he recognized its usefulness. The Theosophists had developed a vocabulary and a set of concepts that could be repurposed for fiction. More importantly, they had created an audience familiar with the idea that dimensions were multiple, that travel between them was possible, and that such travel carried risks. What the weird fiction writers did was strip away the comfort. Gnostics believed escape was possible. Kabbalists believed repair was underway. Theosophists believed in spiritual evolution toward higher planes. Lovecraft and his circle kept the multiple dimensions but removed the hope. Their dimensions weren't stages on a journey toward enlightenment. They were simply there, vast and indifferent, containing entities that had no interest in human salvation. The antecedents provided the architecture. The 20th century provided the emptiness inside it. The word dimension comes from the Latin dimentio, meaning a measuring out. It implies something that can be quantified, bounded, known. When we speak of the dimensions of a room, we're asserting a kind of mastery. We have taken the measure of the space. It holds no surprises. This is precisely why the phrase unstable dimension carries such peculiar force. It's almost a contradiction. A dimension, by definition, is what allows measurement to occur. An unstable dimension is a place where measurement itself becomes unreliable, where the tools we use to understand space turn against us. The weird fiction writers understood this linguistic tension intuitively. They weaponized it. Lovecraft's favorite spatial adjective was non-Euclidean. He used it constantly, in contexts that would have made actual mathematicians wince. In proper mathematical usage, non-Euclidean geometries are perfectly consistent systems. They simply operate with different axioms than the geometry taught in schools. Spherical geometry, hyperbolic geometry. These are not chaotic or maddening. They're rigorous and internally coherent. But Lovecraft wasn't writing for mathematicians. He was borrowing the term's connotation of wrongness, of deviation from the expected. When he describes the geometry of R'lyeh as non-Euclidean, he means something more radical than an alternative axiomatic system. He means geometry that contradicts itself, that cannot be processed by a human mind accustomed to living in consistent space. The word became, in his usage, a shorthand for spatial nightmare. Angles appear obsessively in this literature. Walter Gilman walks through angles that don't belong to normal space. The Hounds of Tindalos, in Frank Belknap Long's story, can only enter our dimension through angles, specifically the angles of time. Curves offer some protection, which is why the protagonist desperately tries to round off the corners of his room. The angle becomes a symbol of dimensional vulnerability, a place where realities meet and sometimes bleed through. Why angles? Perhaps because angles are where surfaces change direction. They are points of transition. A wall becomes another wall. A floor becomes a wall. In stable space, these transitions are predictable and harmless. But if dimensions can overlap, if the fabric of space can thin, it might thin most readily where there's already a seam. The angle as wound, as weakness in the structure. The corner of your room as a potential point of invasion. The vocabulary of instability in weird. Fiction clusters around certain verbs. Dimensions don't simply exist in these stories. They seep, bleed, fray, unravel. They leak into one another. And these are organic metaphors, suggesting that dimensions are more like membranes than like containers, more like tissues that can tear than like boxes with fixed walls. The choice of language implies that whatever separates one dimension from another is not sturdy. It's fragile. It can be damaged. Spatial words get repurposed as threats. Depth becomes dangerous because who knows what might be down there. Vastness implies not wonder, but the terror of exposure, of being seen by something immense. Expanse suggests vulnerability, the absence of shelter. Even distance becomes frightening, because in unstable dimensional space, distance might not protect you. Something very far away might also be very close, if the dimensions fold correctly. The names given to specific dimensions and dimensional regions follow revealing patterns. Lovecraft's dreamlands contain places called Kadath, Ulthar, the Plateau of Leng. These names sound vaguely Central Asian, vaguely ancient, vaguely drawn from fragmentary texts that might once have been more complete. They create the impression of a partially documented geography, a cartographer's notes from incomplete expeditions. But the truly unstable regions resist even this kind of naming. The ultimate void, the outer dark, the gulf. These are descriptions, not proper names. They identify their reference by function or quality rather than by the conventions of geography. You name a place when you understand it well enough to distinguish it from other places. You describe a place when it won't hold still long enough for a name to stick. Writers in this tradition also invented terminology that mimics scientific or occult discourse. Tillinghast's resonator, the silver key, the shining trapezohedron. These terms sound technical. They imply that someone, somewhere, has systematized this knowledge, built devices to exploit it, written manuals that explain its principles. The false precision is part of the effect. It suggests that unstable dimensions can be approached methodically, even if such approaches inevitably end in catastrophe. Language itself starts to fail in these spaces. Characters struggle to describe what they've seen. Words come out wrong, or no words seem adequate. The breakdown of language signals the breakdown of the dimension it's trying to describe. Lovecraft did something clever, and he did it so consistently that readers sometimes miss how deliberate it was. He made his impossible places feel documented, not explained, never fully explained, but documented. There's a difference. A story can present a monster and describe its origins, its weaknesses, its motivations. That's explanation. Or a story can present a monster through fragments, a mention in an old journal, a reference in a letter, a newspaper clipping that doesn't quite make sense until later. That's documentation. Documentation implies that the subject existed before anyone started writing about it and will continue existing after the document ends. It suggests a reality that exceeds any single account. The Necronomicon is the most famous example. This fictional grimoire appears across dozens of Lovecraft stories, always at a slight remove. Characters have heard of it. Libraries own chained copies. Scholars have attempted translations. Each mention adds detail, but the details never quite cohere into a complete picture. We learn it was written by the mad Arab, Abdul al-Hazred. We learn it contains information about the Old Ones and about dimensional travel. We learn that reading it tends to damage the reader. What we never learn is exactly what it says. This fragmentary approach creates a peculiar effect. Readers begin to feel that the Necronomicon must exist somewhere, if only because so many fictional people have encountered it. The reality effect is strong, enough that actual occult publishers have produced their own versions, attempting to fill the gap that Lovecraft deliberately left empty. None of these productions carry the charge of the original references, because the power was always in the absence, not in any possible content. Lovecraft extended this technique through his correspondence network. He encouraged other writers to reference his invented books, his dimensional entities, his cursed New England geography. Clark Ashton Smith mentioned Tsathoggua, and Lovecraft mentioned Tsathoggua back. Robert E. Howard added his own touches. August Derleth systematized everything he could get his hands on. The result was a shared mythology that felt discovered rather than invented, as though multiple independent researchers were all studying the same underlying phenomena. The stories themselves often adopt academic framing devices. A professor recounts his investigation. A scholarly paper describes anomalous findings. An antiquarian explains the provenance of a disturbing artifact. These frames accomplish several things simultaneously. They establish the narrator as someone educated, someone not prone to superstition, someone whose eventual breakdown therefore carries more weight. They create distance between the cosmic events and the reader, making the horror feel safer while paradoxically making it feel more plausible. And they suggest that dimensional instability is a subject that can be studied, even if such study is inadvisable. The contradictions between accounts serve the mythology rather than undermining it. When one story places Rillier in the Pacific and another suggests different coordinates, this doesn't register as authorial carelessness. It registers as the kind of discrepancy you'd expect from witnesses to something genuinely incomprehensible. Real historical events generate contradictory documentation all the time. Why should encounters with unstable dimensions be any different? Oral tradition plays its role too. Characters in these stories often receive their first warnings from elderly locals, from family members with traumatic memories, from the kinds of people whose testimony would never appear in academic journals, but who possess knowledge that the Academy lacks. The old man who remembers what happened at the Whately farm. The fisherman who won't sail past certain coordinates. The grandmother who knows which words should never be spoken aloud. This folk layer gives the mythology roots, suggests that communities have been managing dimensional threats for generations using methods that predate scientific rationalism. The weird fiction writers also understood the power of the forbidden. Knowledge of unstable dimensions doesn't circulate freely in their stories. It's hidden in restricted library collections. It's passed through secret societies. It's encoded in languages that few can read. This restriction creates desire. Readers want to know what the characters are, warned against knowing. The forbidden book becomes more alluring precisely because we're told we shouldn't read it. All these techniques work together to create what might be called a mythology of evidence. The unstable dimensions are supported not by explanation, but by accumulation. Each new story adds another witness, another fragment, another piece of a puzzle that can never be completed, because completion would domesticate the very thing that makes it frightening. The dimensions stay unstable, partly because the documentation never settles into a final form. What does it actually mean for a dimension to be unstable? The phrase gets used loosely, but the weird fiction writers had something specific in mind, something that distinguishes their invented spaces from the merely exotic or dangerous. An unstable dimension is not simply a place where bad things happen. Plenty of fictional locations feature monsters, traps, hostile environments. You could die in these places, certainly, but you could also understand them. You could make a plan. An unstable dimension refuses even this small comfort. The instability is ontological, meaning it affects the basic categories through which we understand existence. Not just dangerous, but unreliable at the level of what things are. Consider the philosophical concept of ground. We assume in ordinary experience that reality has a foundation. Physical objects rest on surfaces. Beliefs rest on evidence. Effects rest on causes. The ground may be difficult to perceive directly, but we trust that it exists. Remove the ground and everything built upon it collapses. Unstable dimensions have no ground, or rather, they have ground that shifts, dissolves, reconstitutes itself according to principles we cannot anticipate. In Lovecraft's descriptions of Relia, the risen city where Cthulhu sleeps, sailors cannot tell whether they're climbing up or sliding down. The geometry refuses to communicate basic spatial relationships. There's no stable reference point from which to orient yourself. This is what groundlessness feels like when translated into architecture. The ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus famously declared that everything flows, that you cannot step into the same river twice. He meant this as a description of ordinary reality, which is already more changeable than we tend to admit. The unstable dimensions of cosmic horror take Heraclitean flux to its terrifying conclusion. Not just change, but incompatible change. Things becoming what they cannot be, while somehow remaining what they were. The river not merely flowing, but flowing in contradictory directions simultaneously. Entropy appears throughout this literature as a dimensional force. The second law of thermodynamics tells us that closed systems tend toward disorder, that energy disperses, that structure decays. Weird fiction extends this principle to dimensions themselves. Some dimensions are dying. Some dimensions are already dead and don't know it, yet. The dimension glimpsed in Hodgson's The House on the Borderland is running down, aging at an accelerated rate, its sun bloating and fading while the earth freezes. Time itself is decaying there, becoming inconsistent, full of gaps and stutters. Dreams occupy a peculiar position in dimensional cosmology. Lovecraft's dreamlands exist. They have geography and history, but they exist contingently. A dreamer creates aspects of this dimension simply by dreaming them. A powerful enough dreamer might dream entire cities into being. This means the dreamlands are inherently unstable because consciousness is unstable. Moods shift, attention wanders, dreamers wake up. The dimension built from dreams flickers accordingly. There's a deeper suggestion in some of this literature. What if our waking dimension is also being dreamed? Azathoth, the blind idiot god at the center of ultimate chaos, is sometimes described as a dreamer whose dreams constitute reality. If this is true, then our apparent stability is borrowed, contingent on the continued sleep of something that might wake at any moment. We become figures in someone else's unstable mental space, as vulnerable as dream characters to the dreamer's shifting attention. Mathematics, which ought to represent pure stability, becomes instead a source of danger. Walter Gilman's studies allow him to perceive dimensional angles precisely because mathematics provides tools adequate to the task. But adequacy here means exposure. The equations that describe dimensional transition don't just describe it, they enact it. There's no safe theoretical distance. To understand the mathematics of unstable space is already to be partially present in that space. Fractal geometry suggests another mode of instability. A fractal pattern contains itself at every scale. Zoom in, and you find the same structure repeating infinitely. Some described dimensions have this quality of infinite regress. Spaces that contain spaces that contain spaces, with no fundamental level where the nesting ends. You could fall forever through such a dimension, always finding another layer beneath the one you just passed through. What these concepts share is a refusal of limits. Stable dimensions have edges, boundaries, rules that hold from one moment to the next. Unstable dimensions overflow every container we try to place them in. They exceed our categories. They make a mockery of measurement. And measurement, remember, is what dimension originally meant. The unstable dimensions of cosmic horror are not empty. They have inhabitants, though inhabitants may be the wrong word. It implies something living inside a container, when often the relationship is more like the relationship between a wave and the ocean. The entities and the dimensions they occupy are not always separable. Cthulhu provides the most famous example, and also one of the most misunderstood. Popular culture has turned him into a kind of mascot, a tentacled god with merchandise and plush toys. But in Lovecraft's original story, Cthulhu is not primarily a monster. He's a symptom. His city, R'lyeh, rises from the Pacific due to seismic activity, and the geometry of that city is the actual horror. Cthulhu himself appears only briefly, damaged by a ship's prow, and sinks back beneath the waves. The lasting impression is not of the entity, but of the space he occupies, the nightmare corpse city, where angles behave wrongly and sanity erodes simply from proximity. Yog-Sothoth represents something more radical. Lovecraft describes this being as coterminous with all time and space, meaning that Yog-Sothoth doesn't travel through dimensions so much as constitute them. The entity is the gate and the key to the gate. To encounter Yog-Sothoth is to encounter dimensionality itself in personified form. This is why summoning rituals directed at Yog-Sothoth tend to produce spatial distortions rather than a clear manifestation. You can't summon something that's already everywhere. Azathoth occupies the theoretical center of this cosmology, and the theoretical center is chaos. Described as a blind idiot god surrounded by fluting, piping servitors, Azathoth represents the nuclear chaos at the heart of infinity. The instability of every other dimension might be understood as emanating from this source. Azathoth doesn't intend anything, doesn't want anything, possesses no consciousness in any recognizable sense. The horror is precisely this absence of intent. The foundation of all dimensions is mindless, and the dimensions that cascade from it inherit that fundamental mindlessness. Nyarlathotep presents a different case. This entity moves between dimensions deliberately, takes multiple forms, interacts with humans in ways that seem almost comprehensible. He's called the messenger of the outer gods, which implies that communication between dimensional levels is possible. But Nyarlathotep's messages never clarify anything. They mock. They disturb. They drive people toward madness. If the other outer gods are indifferent to humanity, Nyarlathotep seems actively interested, and his interest is worse than indifference. Lesser entities populate these unstable spaces in greater numbers. The Mygo, fungoid creatures from Yog-Sothoth, have mastered dimensional travel to the point where they can remove human brains and carry them across cosmic distances in metal cylinders. Their technology implies that dimensional instability can be navigated, even exploited, by intelligences sufficiently alien. The Hounds of Tindalos, from Frank Belknap Long's contribution to the mythos, exist in the angles of time rather than space. They hunt anything that has traveled through time, emerging from corners with patient, inexorable hunger. Their existence suggests that time has geometry, that temporal dimensions have their own architecture of angles and curves. Some dimensional forces are not entities at all. The color out of space describes something that arrives on a meteorite and infects the surrounding land. It's called a color because it has no other identifiable property. It's not alive in any conventional sense. It drains vitality from everything it touches, plants and animals and people, leaving behind gray Brittite ash. The color is a property of another dimension manifesting in ours, a kind of radiation that our physics cannot measure or explain. No one defeats it. No one understands it. It simply fades after it has consumed what it came for, and the blasted heath it leaves behind never recovers. Dimensional contamination appears throughout the literature as a force distinct from any entity. Proximity to unstable dimensions changes things. The air feels different near a thin place. Animals behave strangely. Sensitive individuals experience headaches, nightmares, premonitions. The dimension itself exerts influence even when nothing crosses over. It's as though instability were contagious, as though our dimension could catch it like a disease. The entities matter less than what they represent. They embody the principle that unstable dimensions are not just differently organized versions of our reality. They operate according to rules that have no translation into human terms. The beings that thrive there are adapted to conditions we cannot survive, and their very existence testifies to how provincial our assumptions about life really are. People in these stories go mad. It happens so frequently that readers sometimes treat it as a cliché, a convenient way to end a narrative when the author has run out of ideas. But the madness in cosmic horror serves a specific function. It's not a failure of the characters. It's a failure of the interface between human consciousness and dimensional reality. Think of the mind as a kind of filter. William James, the psychologist and philosopher, proposed something like this in the early 1900s. The brain, he suggested, doesn't produce consciousness so much as constrain it, narrowing the overwhelming flood of reality into a manageable stream. We perceive what we need to perceive for survival. Everything else gets filtered out. This is a mercy. Without the filter, we would be paralyzed by the sheer volume of information available at any moment. Unstable dimensions break the filter. The resonator in From Beyond works exactly this way, stimulating the pineal gland until perception expands beyond its normal limits. What Tillinghast's subjects see is not a different world, but the same world with the filter removed. The air fills with drifting, predatory shapes. The room extends in directions that shouldn't exist. Ordinary space reveals itself as crowded, layered, entirely unsafe. The madness that follows is not random. It's the mind's desperate attempt to process input it was never designed to receive. Some victims go catatonic, withdrawing entirely from a reality that has become unbearable. Some become obsessive, fixating on geometric patterns or mathematical relationships, as though these might provide the key to understanding what they've seen. Some lose the ability to distinguish between dimensions, perceiving our world and others simultaneously, unable to determine which is primary. Lovecraft's protagonists often describe a period of adjustment before full madness sets in. They see something impossible, and at first the mind simply refuses to register it. The thing cannot be there, so it isn't there. Denial holds for a while. Then details start to accumulate. The angles of a room don't add up correctly. Shadows fall in the wrong direction. A sound seems to come from inside the skull rather than outside it. The filter is failing, letting more through, and each new perception makes the next one easier. Cults exploit this vulnerability deliberately. The worshippers of the old ones seek dimensional contact. They use rituals, drugs, meditation techniques designed to thin the barrier between mind and cosmos. Their madness is voluntary, or at least initiated voluntarily. They want to perceive what the filter hides. They believe that contact with greater dimensions will elevate them, transform them, make them more than human. Sometimes it does. The cult leaders in these stories often possess knowledge and abilities that ordinary people lack. They can survive exposures that would destroy an unprepared mind. They've adapted, in their way. But the adaptation always costs something. They become less human as they become more cosmically aware. They stop caring about the things that humans care about. They serve purposes that originate outside human concerns entirely. There's another kind of madness that appears in this literature, subtler than the dramatic breakdowns. Characters sometimes return from dimensional encounters apparently intact. They resume their normal lives. But something has shifted. They know too much now, and the knowledge sits inside them like a splinter. They can function, mostly, but the world has lost its solidity. They look at walls and wonder what's behind them. They look at corners and feel faint dread. The dimension never fully releases them. This ambient madness might be the most realistic element in these otherwise fantastical stories. Anyone who has experienced trauma knows the feeling. The world looks the same, but it doesn't feel the same. A gap has opened between appearance and reality, and the gap never quite closes. Cosmic horror simply scales this experience up, makes the trauma ontological rather than personal. Sanity, in this framework, is not a stable possession. It's an achievement, a continuous effort to maintain coherence in a reality that doesn't inherently support coherence. The characters who go mad in these stories aren't weak. They've simply been exposed to more truth than the human system can metabolize. their breakdowns are accurate responses to accurate perceptions. The rest of us stay sane only because we haven't seen what they've seen. And the dimensions, being unstable, are always potentially visible. The filter could fail at any time. Something could thin the barrier without warning. There's a peculiar paradox at the center of cosmic horror literature. The stories are full of books, full of research, full of scholars and antiquarians piecing together obscure histories. Knowledge is everywhere. Characters spend enormous effort acquiring it. And yet the consistent message is that knowledge is dangerous, that some things should not be known, that understanding itself can be a form of destruction. This isn't simple anti-intellectualism. Lovecraft was himself obsessively intellectual, filling his letters with discussions of philosophy, science, history, aesthetics. His protagonists are typically educated men who approach mysteries with scholarly methodology. The horror is not that they pursue knowledge, but that knowledge in certain domains pursues back. The Necronomicon embodies this danger. It's a book, a physical object, something you could theoretically check out from a library if your credentials were good enough. It contains information about the old ones, about dimensional travel, about the true structure of the cosmos. Reading it teaches you things, but the things it teaches change you. Readers of the Necronomicon don't simply add new facts to their existing worldview. Their worldview cracks, reforms, becomes something incompatible with ordinary human functioning. Why should knowledge work this way? One answer involves what philosophers call epistemic frameworks. We don't just know individual facts. We know facts within structures that organize them, that determine what counts as relevant, what counts as evidence, what counts as a reasonable conclusion. These structures are invisible during normal operation. We don't notice the framework any more than a fish notices water. Forbidden knowledge in cosmic horror disrupts the framework itself. Learning about unstable dimensions doesn't just add information about other places. It undermines the entire concept of place as a stable category. Learning about entities like Yog-Sothoth doesn't just introduce a new being into your catalog of creatures. It forces you to reconsider what being means, what entity means, whether these concepts apply across dimensional boundaries. The knowledge is corrosive, not because the facts are disturbing, but because the facts dissolve the structures that make ordinary facts possible. This helps explain why the forbidden books in these stories take physical form. Knowledge dangerous enough to collapse epistemic frameworks cannot circulate freely. It has to be contained, limited, kept in restricted collections where access requires deliberate effort. The grimoire, the ancient manuscript, the tablet covered in non-human script. These are containment devices. They hold knowledge that would spread uncontrollably if it weren't anchored to rare physical objects. Characters who seek this knowledge always believe they can handle it. Walter Gilman thinks his mathematical training has prepared him for dimensional travel. Crawford Tillinghast thinks his scientific methodology will protect him from the revelations of the resonator. The scholars who consult forbidden texts believe that scholarly detachment will maintain the necessary distance. They're all wrong. The knowledge doesn't care about your preparation. It doesn't recognize the distinction between observer and observed. Mathematics plays a strange role here. You might expect mathematics to be safe, abstract, purely formal. But in these stories, certain mathematical insights function as keys or doorways. To understand the equations is already to be partially present in the spaces they describe. There's no purely theoretical relationship. The math does something. Walter Gilman's studies don't just describe dimensional angles. They teach him to perceive and eventually to traverse them. The knowledge is performative rather than merely descriptive. Language itself starts to fail as epistemic collapse progresses. Characters struggle to articulate what they've learned. They resort to approximations, metaphors, newly coined terms that don't quite capture their reference. Lovecraft's famous adjectives, Eldritch, encyclopean, and non-Euclidean, represent exactly this failure. They gesture toward meanings they cannot specify. The vocabulary of cosmic horror is a vocabulary of inadequacy, of language reaching toward experiences that language cannot contain. The ultimate forbidden knowledge might be structural rather than propositional. It might not be any particular fact about unstable dimensions, but rather the recognition that our entire epistemic apparatus is local, contingent, and vulnerable. We know things because we exist in a dimension that permits knowing. Other dimensions might not. The very activity of knowledge might be a provincial habit, something that works here but fails elsewhere. This recognition, once achieved, cannot be unachieved. You can forget facts. You cannot forget that facts are fragile. The scholars who pursue forbidden knowledge are not seeking information. They're seeking transformation. And transformation, unlike information, cannot be refused once it begins. The unstable dimension as a literary device did not arrive fully formed. It developed through a series of experiments, each author building on predecessors while pushing towards something more radical. Tracing these early appearances reveals a gradual escalation, a growing willingness to abandon the safety of comprehensible space. Arthur Machen's 1894 novella, The Great God Pan, doesn't describe other dimensions explicitly, but it establishes crucial groundwork. A surgical procedure allows a woman to perceive what lies behind ordinary reality. The experience destroys her mind immediately. Her daughter, born from a subsequent supernatural union, moves through London society, leaving madness and death in her wake. Machen never specifies what Helen Vaughn actually is, or where her other half originates. The power of the story lies in this refusal. Something exists beyond the veil of perception, something that makes people kill themselves, rather than live with having glimpsed it. Algernon Blackwood's 1907 story, The Willows, brings dimensional instability into sharper focus. Two travelers camping on an island in the Danube become aware that they've stopped in a thin place, a location where another dimension presses close against ours. The willows surrounding them seem to multiply overnight. The ground develops funnel-shaped depressions. Something wants through, and the barrier is weakening. Blackwood's genius lies in keeping the other dimension almost entirely offstage. We know it's there. We feel its pressure. We never see it clearly. The protagonists survive only because the dimension claims another victim instead. A drowned body that floats past, bearing the same funnel-shaped wounds that have appeared in the earth. William Hope Hodgson's The House on the Borderland appeared in 1908 and remains the most ambitious early attempt to depict dimensional instability directly. The narrative frame presents a manuscript discovered in the ruins of an old house in Ireland. The manuscript's author describes visions of cosmic scope, a vast plain dominated by a house identical to his own, surrounded by crouching gods, a journey through time in which he watches the sun age and die, pig-like entities besieging his home from some adjacent reality. Hodgson doesn't merely suggest that other dimensions exist. He attempts to render them on the page, to describe what accelerated time feels like, to capture the texture of a space where natural laws operate differently. The house itself functions as a dimensional anchor. It exists in multiple realities simultaneously, which is why it attracts the attention of entities from elsewhere. This concept, the location that bridges dimensions rather than the ritual or device, would prove enormously influential. Lovecraft admired Hodgson's work and adapted the concept for his own purposes. The farmhouse in The Color Out of Space, the witch house in Arkham, the risen city of Rillier, all are places where dimensional barriers have thinned or failed. Lovecraft's own early dimensional experiments proceeded cautiously. Polaris, written in 1918, describes a dreamer who perceives another life in a distant city, a life that may be more real than his waking existence. The dimensional status of this other place remains ambiguous. Is it the past? Another world? A delusion? Lovecraft doesn't resolve the question. The White Ship, from 1919, sends its protagonist sailing toward a sequence of fantastical lands, each representing a different spiritual or aesthetic state. The journey ends in catastrophe when the traveler seeks a forbidden destination and his ship is destroyed. These early stories treat other dimensions as allegorical rather than physical, as states of consciousness rather than places with independent existence. The transition to more radical instability came gradually. Cellophane, written in 1920, describes a dreamer who creates an entire city through the sustained effort of his imagination. The city persists, other dreamers can visit it, but it depends on its creator's continued dreaming. When he dies in the waking world, he achieves permanent residence in his creation. The implication is troubling. If dreamed dimensions can become real, what does that say about the ontological status of any dimension, including ours? By the time Lovecraft wrote The Call of Cthulhu in 1926, the pieces had assembled into a coherent vision. Rillier rises from the Pacific, and its geometry drives sailors mad. The dimension that Cthulhu inhabits has different spatial rules, and those rules contaminate our space simply through proximity. Earlier authors had suggested that other dimensions might be dangerous. Lovecraft demonstrated that they could be structurally incompatible with human existence, hostile not through intention, but through fundamental incommensurability. Lovecraft wrote The Dreams in the Witch House in early 1932, and he wasn't satisfied with it. His letters describe frustration with the story's execution, a sense that he hadn't quite captured what he was reaching for. Critics at the time and since have often agreed, finding the tale overloaded and structurally awkward. But the story's flaws are inseparable from its ambitions. Lovecraft was attempting something that might not be achievable, a precise depiction of dimensional spaces that are by definition imprecise. Walter Gilman is a mathematics student at Miskatonic University. He rents a room in an old house, a room once occupied by Keziah Mason, a witch executed in Salem in 1692. The room's angles are wrong. Gilman notices this immediately, notices that the walls meet the ceiling in ways that seem to violate basic geometry. His mathematical training allows him to perceive what others might dismiss as mere architectural oddity. The angles aren't mistakes. They're deliberate configurations that create points of dimensional weakness. Keziah Mason, we learn, escaped her Salem prison cell by walking through such angles. The court records note that she simply vanished from a locked room, leaving behind only strange curves traced on the walls. She had discovered, through whatever means, that certain geometric arrangements function as doorways. Mathematics is not merely descriptive in this framework, it's operative. The right equations, properly understood, don't just explain dimensional travel, they enable it. Gilman begins dreaming of other places. The dreams are not random. They follow a progression, taking him deeper into spaces that his waking mind can barely process. He sees a twilight abysses where geometry operates according to alien principles. He perceives angles that could not belong to anything right or proper in this earth. The language here strains against its own limitations. Lovecraft wants to describe the indescribable, to render impossible spaces in sentences that must follow the rules of ordinary grammar. Brown Jenkin appears in these dreams and eventually outside them. This creature, Keziah's familiar, combines the body of a large rat with a disturbingly human face. Brown Jenkin exists in multiple dimensional states simultaneously. He can move through walls not by any physical means, but by sliding between the spaces that walls occupy. His presence indicates that the dimensional barriers around Gilman are failing, that the angles of his room are becoming active. The story escalates toward a confrontation that Gilman doesn't choose and can't avoid. Keziah wants him for a ritual. She needs him to participate in a sacrifice, the killing of a human infant, which will cement some dimensional arrangement that the story never fully explains. Gilman resists, but his resistance operates within a space that Keziah controls. The room has become a trap. The dimensions have shifted around him while he slept. One of the most disturbing sequences describes Gilman's perception of Azathoth's court. He glimpses the nuclear chaos at the center of existence, the blind idiot god surrounded by piping, amorphous servitors. This is the ultimate dimensional destination, the place from which all dimensional instability originates. Gilman sees it only briefly, and the seeing nearly destroys him. He doesn't travel there voluntarily. The dimensions carry him, as though the unstable spaces he's been traversing all led eventually to this terminus. The ending refuses resolution. Gilman dies, his heart apparently torn out by Brown Jenkin, who is found dead beside him in the walls of the room. But the dimensions don't close. The angles remain wrong. Years later, when the house is demolished, workers discover bones in the sealed spaces between walls, small bones, child-sized, too many of them, accumulated over centuries. Keziah's rituals have been ongoing. Gilman was not the first victim, and presumably not the last. What makes the story effective, despite its acknowledged problems, is the texture of wrongness that accumulates. Lovecraft piles detail on detail, each one slightly impossible, until the reader feels the dimensional pressure that Gilman experiences. The mathematics references, which Lovecraft admitted he didn't fully understand himself, create an atmosphere of technical precision applied to subjects that refuse precision. Gilman is trying to be scientific about spaces that exist outside scientific categories. The story's lesson is uncomfortable. Education doesn't protect you from unstable dimensions. It exposes you to them. Gilman's mathematical training is exactly what makes him vulnerable. He can perceive what others can't, which means the things that hunt through dimensions can perceive him in return. Lovecraft wrote From Beyond in 1920, early in his mature career, and the story's brevity belies its influence. At just over 2,000 words, it establishes a template that countless later works would follow. The scientific device that reveals hidden dimensions, the visionary who has seen too much, the skeptic who becomes a believer at terrible cost. The story takes perhaps 10 minutes to read. Its implications take considerably longer to shake. Crawford Tillinghast has invented a machine. The narrator, his former friend, visits Tillinghast's laboratory after receiving a disturbing summons. The house is dark. The servants have fled or died. Tillinghast himself has transformed, grown gaunt and wild-eyed, aged decades in the weeks since their last meeting. He speaks of having seen beyond the veil, of having activated dormant senses that most humans never use. The narrator assumes madness. Tillinghast insists on demonstration. The machine works by stimulating the pineal gland, which Tillinghast calls the great sense organ of organs. Historical occult traditions associated the pineal with spiritual perception, the third eye of mystical literature. Tillinghast has mechanized this folklore. His resonator emits waves that awaken latent perceptual capacities, allowing the affected subject to see what has always surrounded them, but remained invisible. What surrounds them is not empty space. The air fills with drifting, swimming shapes, creatures that exist in dimensional frequencies normally imperceptible. Some are small, almost decorative. Others are large and predatory. They move through the laboratory, through the walls, through the bodies of the two men. They have always been here. Every room, every street, every seemingly empty space teems with them. The revelation is not that another dimension exists elsewhere. The revelation is that we have never been alone, not for a single moment. Tillinghast's transformation extends beyond his physical deterioration. He has lost the boundaries that define normal identity. He speaks of merging with the forces he's perceived, of becoming something other than human. His scientific curiosity has curdled into something resembling religious ecstasy, but the religion serves no God that cares about humanity. He wants to share his vision, to force his friend to see what he has seen, and the desire has become compulsion. The resonator isn't just a perception device, it's an evangelical tool. The dimensional ecology revealed by the machine follows its own rules. The entities that drift through the air are not ghosts or spirits in any traditional sense. They're fauna, organisms adapted to conditions that human biology cannot tolerate. Some of them seem aware of the two men, drawn by the resonator's activation. Perception, it turns out, works both ways. To see into another dimension is to become visible from that dimension. The resonator creates a two-way window, and some of what looks back through that window is hungry. Tillinghast understands this and doesn't care. He has passed beyond concern for his own survival. What drives him now is the need to communicate his discovery, even if communication kills the recipient. The narrator realizes that Tillinghast's invitation was not friendly. It was predatory. The former friend wants witnesses, wants validation, wants others to share the burden of knowing what he knows. The story ends in violence and darkness. The narrator shoots into the machinery, destroying the resonator. Tillinghast dies, struck down by either the gunfire or by something that enters through the dimensional opening before it closes. The narrator survives but cannot forget. He knows now that the world contains more than he can see. The filter has been damaged. It will never work quite right again. What makes From Beyond so durable is its simplicity. There's no elaborate mythology, no ancient gods, no forbidden books. There's just a machine and what it reveals. The horror is democratic. Anyone with a working pineal gland is vulnerable. Anyone could build a resonator if they knew how. The dimensional threat doesn't require cultists or cosmic alignments. It requires only curiosity and engineering skill. Stuart Gordon's 1986 film adaptation expanded the story considerably, adding body horror and sexual elements that weren't present in Lovecraft's original. But the core concept remained intact. Perception as danger, knowledge as contamination, the terrible democracy of a revelation that spares no one who receives it. The resonator has become an archetype, the ancestor of every fictional device that opens doors that should stay closed. Tillinghast wanted to share what he learned. The story suggests that sharing itself is the problem. Lovecraft died in 1937, impoverished and largely unknown outside the small community of pulp magazine readers. He might have remained a footnote in literary history, if not for the efforts of August Derleth, a Wisconsin writer who had corresponded with Lovecraft and admired his work. Derleth co-founded Arkham House specifically to preserve and publish Lovecraft's writings. He also did something more controversial. He continued the mythology himself, expanding and systematizing what Lovecraft had left deliberately fragmentary. Derleth's contributions to dimensional cosmology were substantial and problematic. He organized the chaotic pantheon of Lovecraft's entities into categories, assigning elemental associations and moral alignments. Cthulhu became a water elemental. Other beings represented earth, air, fire. More troublingly, Derleth introduced elder gods who opposed the malevolent old ones, creating a cosmic struggle between good and evil that Lovecraft had specifically avoided. The dimensions in Derleth's version became battlegrounds rather than indifferent spaces. Critics have debated Derleth's legacy for decades. His systematization made the mythology more accessible, more usable for other writers, and eventually for game designers. But it also domesticated the horror. Lovecraft's dimensions were frightening precisely because they contained no moral framework, no possibility of divine rescue. Derleth's revisions introduced hope, and hope diminishes cosmic dread. The unstable dimensions became less unstable, more comprehensible, more like the fantasy realms that Lovecraft had rejected. Clark Ashton Smith took a different approach during Lovecraft's lifetime and after. Smith's prose style was lush, ornate, deliberately excessive where Lovecraft's was clinical and restrained. His dimensional spaces reflected this aesthetic difference. Zothique, a continent existing in Earth's far future, presented a world of decadence and decay rather than geometric impossibility. Hyperborea, set in the distant past, featured sorcerers and alien gods, but rendered them with almost sensual detail. Smith's most significant dimensional contribution was The City of the Singing Flame, published in 1931. The story describes a portal to another dimension, where a great flame burns eternally, producing music that compels all who hear it to approach and eventually enter. Beings from countless dimensions make pilgrimage to this flame, walking into it and dissolving. The flame is not malevolent. It's simply attractive beyond resistance. Smith introduced the concept of dimensional seduction, of spaces that draw consciousness toward them, not through threat, but through irresistible appeal. Robert Bloch, who began corresponding with Lovecraft as a teenager, eventually shifted the dimensional focus inward. His stories explored psychological dimensions, the spaces inside disturbed minds that might be as real as external geography. Notebook Found in a Deserted House uses Lovecraftian elements, but filters them through a child's perspective, making the dimensional intrusion feel like a violation of innocence rather than a cosmic revelation. Bloch's later career, including Psycho, moved away from explicit cosmic horror, but retained the sense that internal and external realities might not be reliably distinct. Ramsey Campbell, writing from the 1960s onward, created his own British dimensional geography. The Severn Valley in his stories contains thin places where other realities press close. His entity Yog-Sothoth represents a dimension of obscenity, a space defined by transgression and violation. Campbell's innovation was making dimensional instability feel domestic urban, possible in familiar settings. His horrors emerge in Liverpool streets and Brichester libraries, not in remote New England villages. Thomas Ligotti, beginning in the 1980s, pushed dimensional concepts toward corporate and bureaucratic horror. His stories feature factories that exist in multiple realities, towns managed by entities that might be dimensional parasites, businesses whose organizational charts extend into impossible territories. The Red Tower describes a factory that produces mysterious objects, according to processes no one understands, located in a landscape that might be another dimension or might be the underside of our own. Ligotti's dimensions are unstable in administrative rather than geometric ways. They follow procedures that humans cannot comprehend, serving purposes that humans cannot identify. Contemporary writers have continued expanding these territories. Laird Barron's stories feature a parasitic cosmic entity called Old Leech, whose dimensional nature remains deliberately unclear. Caitlin R. Kiernan approaches dimensional instability through paleontology and deep time, suggesting that prehistoric eras were dimensionally different from our own. John Langan's The Fisherman treats grief itself as a dimensional state, a space where the bereaved become vulnerable to entities that feed on loss. The collaborative tradition continues. The mythology remains open, unstable, available for further exploration. Something strange happens when fictional dimensions persist long enough in cultural memory. They start to feel real. Not metaphorically real, not symbolically real, but actually real in ways that blur the boundary between invention and documentation. The unstable dimensions of cosmic horror have generated this effect more powerfully than almost any other fictional construct. The Necronomicon provides the clearest example. Lovecraft invented it completely. His letters confirm this without ambiguity. He created the title, the author, Abdul al-Hazred, the publication history involving Latin translations and suppressed editions. It was a literary device, a way to suggest that forbidden knowledge existed in textual form without having to specify what that knowledge actually contained. The power lay in the reference, not in any actual content. Yet the Necronomicon refused to stay fictional. By the 1970s, multiple versions had appeared in occult bookshops, each claiming some connection to authentic esoteric traditions. The Simon Necronomicon, published in 1977, presented itself as a genuine Sumerian grimoire, with only tangential connections to Lovecraft's invention. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies. Readers performed its rituals. Some reported results. The book that never existed had generated real religious practices. This phenomenon extends beyond individual texts. Locations associated with Lovecraftian fiction have acquired reputations as genuinely haunted or dimensionally thin. The town of Marblehead, Massachusetts, which inspired Lovecraft's Kingsport, attracts visitors looking for something they can't quite name. Coastal New England generally has absorbed the mythology, becoming a landscape where dimensional instability feels plausible even to people who know they're responding to fiction. The Winchester Mystery House in San Jose, California, predates Lovecraft's fiction, but has been retrospectively interpreted through its lens. Sarah Winchester, heir to the rifle fortune, built a sprawling mansion with stairs that lead nowhere, doors that open onto walls, windows looking into other rooms. The traditional explanation involves guilt over deaths caused by Winchester rifles and spiritual advice to keep building forever. The cosmic horror interpretation sees the architecture differently. Deliberate geometric confusion designed to prevent dimensional entities from navigating the space. or perhaps to create the kind of angular wrongness that opens passages to elsewhere. UFO discourse has increasingly adopted dimensional language. Jacques Vallée, a computer scientist and UFO researcher, proposed in the 1970s that unidentified aerial phenomena might not be extraterrestrial spacecraft, but intrusions from other dimensions. This hypothesis allowed UFO believers to explain why aliens behaved so inconsistently, why encounters had dreamlike qualities, why physical evidence remained perpetually elusive. The visitors weren't crossing space. They were crossing dimensional barriers, which explained why they flickered in and out of perceivability. The overlap between abduction narratives and cosmic horror imagery is difficult to ignore. Abductees describe experiences of spatial wrongness, of rooms that seem larger inside than outside, of time behaving inconsistently. They report entities that communicate telepathically, that seem uninterested in human concerns, that perform procedures with unclear purposes. The phenomenology matches dimensional contact more closely than it matches conventional science fiction scenarios of aliens from other planets. Internet culture has accelerated the production of dimensional folklore. The SCP Foundation, a collaborative fiction project, presents itself as documentation from a secret organization that contains anomalous objects and entities. Many SCP entries describe dimensional breaches, spaces that don't behave correctly, locations where reality has become locally unstable. The wiki format lends documentary authority to pure invention. Readers sometimes lose track of what's real and what's fiction, which is part of the appeal. The backrooms phenomenon emerged around 2019 from a single unsettling photograph of an empty, yellow-lit office space. The accompanying text suggested that one could accidentally no-clip out of reality and find oneself in endless identical rooms, hunted by entities that shouldn't exist. The concept spread virally, generating art, games, films, and increasingly elaborate mythology. The backrooms became a collaboratively constructed, unstable dimension, built by thousands of contributors who found the concept resonant enough to expand. Why does this happen? Why do fictional dimensions generate belief in ways that fictional characters or fictional events rarely do? Perhaps because dimensions are harder to verify. You can prove that Sherlock Holmes never lived at 221B Baker Street. You cannot prove that dimensional barriers are stable everywhere at all times. The unfalsifiability of dimensional claims makes them available for belief in ways that more concrete fictions are not. The unstable dimensions keep leaking into consensus reality. The boundary between invention and documentation grows thinner. Translating unstable dimensions into visual media presents an inherent contradiction. These spaces are defined by their resistance to representation. They cannot be accurately depicted because accuracy would require geometry that human perception cannot process. Filmmakers and game designers have approached this problem through various strategies, some more successful than others, all revealing something about the limits and possibilities of dimensional horror in different media. Stuart Gordon's 1986 adaptation of From Beyond took the most direct approach: make the invisible viscerally visible. The resonator in Gordon's film doesn't just reveal floating entities. It triggers bodily transformation, causing flesh to mutate and merge. The dimensional becomes physiological. Characters grow new, organs, develop predatory appetites, lose the boundaries that define individual identity. Gordon understood that cinema is a bodily medium, that audiences respond to physical threat more immediately than to abstract spatial wrongness. His solution was to translate dimensional instability into body horror, making the invisible visceral rather than trying to depict the undepictable. Event Horizon, released in 1997, attempted something more ambitious. A spacecraft equipped with an experimental gravity drive has returned from a test voyage, its crew dead, its interior transformed. The drive works by folding space, creating a temporary dimensional breach that allows faster-than-light travel. But the dimension it passes through is not empty. The film suggests that the ship traveled through something like hell, a dimension of pure suffering that has contaminated everything aboard. The horror is that dimensional travel might be possible, but might also be inherently damaging, that any shortcut through space requires passage through territories best left unentered. John Carpenter's In the Mouth of Madness from 1994 approaches dimensional instability through fiction itself. A horror novelist's work has become so popular that it's altering reality. His imagined town manifesting physically, his described entities emerging into the world. The protagonist investigates and discovers that the boundary between the fictional dimension and the real one has collapsed. Carpenter understood that all fiction creates dimensions of a sort, mental spaces that readers inhabit temporarily. His film asks what would happen if inhabitation became permanent, if the fictional dimension proved more stable than the one we call real. Annihilation, Alex Garland's 2018 film, depicts a dimensional anomaly called the Shimmer, an expanding zone where biological and physical laws operate differently. Inside the Shimmer, DNA recombines across species. Plants grow in human shapes. Time becomes unreliable. The zone is unstable, not geometrically, but biologically, a dimension where the categories that define organisms have become fluid. Garland visualized this through haunting images. Flowers shaped like people, a bear that speaks with a dead woman's voice, a lighthouse containing something that mirrors and transforms whatever approaches it. Video games have certain advantages in depicting unstable dimensions. Players don't just observe these spaces, they navigate them. Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem, released for GameCube in 2002, included a sanity meter that depleted as characters encountered cosmic horrors. Low sanity produced perceptual distortions, walls bleeding, statues moving, the game apparently deleting your save file. The dimensional instability affected the player's relationship with the game itself, breaking the fourth wall in ways that film cannot achieve. Bloodborne, From Software's 2015 action game, uses a mechanic called insight. As players accumulate insight through encounters with cosmic entities, they begin perceiving elements of the game world that were previously invisible. New enemies appear. The moon changes. The architecture reveals features that were always present but imperceptible. The game literalizes Lovecraft's concept of the filter, showing players that their initial perception of the game world was incomplete, that a more terrible reality underlies the surface. Control, released in 2019, takes place almost entirely within an unstable dimension. The oldest house is a building that is also a place of power, its interior vastly larger than its exterior, its geography shifting according to rules that no one fully understands. The Federal Bureau of Control attempts to manage the building's anomalies through bureaucratic procedures, which creates a distinctive tonal blend of cosmic horror and workplace mundanity. The game suggests that dimensional instability might be normalized, might become someone's job, without thereby becoming less strange. Musical engagement with dimensional horror tends toward atmosphere rather than narrative. Black metal and dark ambient genres have produced albums explicitly inspired by Lovecraftian concepts. The band Portal performs in costumes that obscure human identity, producing music that sounds like transmissions from dimensional spaces, where melody and rhythm operate according to different principles. The listening experience becomes a kind of dimensional contact, sound serving as a resonator that shifts perception temporarily. The unstable dimensions of cosmic horror have migrated far beyond their origins in pulp magazines. They now circulate through occult practice, academic philosophy, contemporary art, and online communities, each context transforming the concepts while drawing on their persistent power. The journey from weird fiction to university seminar rooms and chaos magic rituals traces an unlikely path, one that reveals how fictional constructs can become genuine tools for thought and practice. Chaos magicians adopted Lovecraftian entities and dimensions beginning in the 1970s. This was not a misunderstanding. Practitioners like Peter Carroll and Phil Hine knew perfectly well that Lovecraft invented his mythology. They argued that this didn't matter, that fictional constructs could become magically operative through sustained belief and ritual engagement. The Cthulhu mythos, in their view, had acquired what they called egregore status, a thought form generated by collective attention that had developed independent existence. Summoning Yog-Sothoth might work not because Lovecraft documented something real, but because enough people had imagined Yog-Sothoth vividly enough to make it real. Kenneth Grant, an English occultist who had worked with Aleister Crowley, went further. His Typhonian tradition explicitly incorporated Lovecraftian dimensions into a comprehensive occult cosmology. Grant argued that Lovecraft had been a genuine visionary, receiving transmissions from actual dimensional entities without understanding what he was receiving. The fiction was accidental documentation. The dimensions were real. Grant's books, dense and difficult, treat cosmic horror geography as territory that can be explored through appropriate techniques. Academic philosophy discovered cosmic horror through Graham Harmon's object-oriented ontology. Harmon, an American philosopher working in the speculative realist tradition, published a book on Lovecraft titled Weird Realism in 2012. He argued that Lovecraft's writing style, with its reliance on vague description and inadequate language, actually accomplished something philosophically significant. By failing to fully represent his subjects, Lovecraft pointed toward the reality of objects that exist beyond human access. The dimensional entities were interesting precisely because they couldn't be captured by human perception or description. They modeled what all objects might be, like beneath the surfaces we perceive. Eugene Thacker's Horror of Philosophy trilogy extended this engagement. Thacker, a philosopher at the New School, used horror fiction as a lens for examining questions about existence, knowledge, and the limits of thought. His books treat cosmic horror as a philosophical method rather than merely a genre. The unstable dimensions become ways of thinking about what lies outside human conceptual frameworks, about the world without us that persists regardless of human observation. Thacker's work has circulated widely, introducing cosmic horror concepts to audiences who might never read the original fiction. Contemporary visual artists have found in cosmic horror a vocabulary for depicting psychological and environmental anxieties. The Polish painter Zdzisław Beksinski, who died in 2005, created dreamlike landscapes populated by skeletal figures and organic architectures that feel dimensionally unstable. His work predates the current cosmic horror revival, but anticipates its aesthetics. H.R. Geiger's biomechanical imagery, most famously realized in the Alien films, depicts dimensions where the organic and mechanical have merged into something that reads as fundamentally wrong. Both artists suggest spaces that could not support human life, that operate according to principles hostile to biological flourishing. Online communities have democratized dimensional world building. The SCP Foundation Wiki contains thousands of entries describing anomalous objects, entities, and locations. Many of these entries involve dimensional phenomena, spaces that are larger inside than outside, locations that exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, portals to places that shouldn't exist. The collaborative nature of the project means that no single author controls the mythology. It grows organically, incorporating contradictions and inconsistencies that actually enhance the sense of dimensional reality. Real phenomena generate contradictory documentation too. The backrooms expanded from a single image and text post into an elaborate collaborative mythology with its own internal geography. Contributors have mapped multiple levels, each with distinct characteristics and dangers. The original concept of endless empty office space has developed into a complex dimensional ecosystem with entities, safe zones, and explorers who document their findings. The fiction presents itself as documentation, and the documentation accumulates faster than any individual can track. What connects these appropriations is a shared recognition that unstable dimensions serve purposes beyond entertainment. They provide frameworks for thinking about experiences and concepts that resist ordinary language. They model encounters with the genuinely unknown. They offer ways of engaging with uncertainty that don't immediately resolve into comforting conclusions. We've spent considerable time examining unstable dimensions as literary constructs, tracing their origins and their cultural migrations. But there's a question we've been circling without directly addressing. Why do these concepts disturb us? What is it about dimensional instability that resonates so persistently with human psychology? The answers reveal something about the architecture of consciousness itself. Spatial reasoning is fundamental to how we think. Cognitive scientists have demonstrated that even abstract reasoning borrows from spatial cognition. We speak of high concepts and deep thoughts, of ideas that are close to each other or far apart. Our metaphors for understanding rely on spatial frameworks that we rarely examine because they're so basic to mental operation. Stable space is not just where we live, it's how we think. Unstable dimensions attack this foundation. They don't merely present danger in the way a predator or a natural disaster presents danger. They threaten the cognitive infrastructure we use to process danger in the first place. This is why descriptions of impossible geometry produce such distinctive unease. The mind attempts to model the described space and fails, and the failure itself becomes the source of horror. We are briefly unable to think in our normal way, and that inability frightens us more than any specific content. Evolutionary psychology offers a complementary explanation. Our ancestors survived by developing acute sensitivity to environmental stability. A landscape that behaved consistently could be learned, predicted, navigated. A landscape that changed without warning was dangerous, not because of any particular threat, but because it prevented the development of reliable responses. We carry this sensitivity into the present. The instability of fictional dimensions triggers ancient alarms that have nothing to do with fiction, alerts designed for environments where unpredictability meant death. There's a paradox at the heart of cosmic horror's appeal. These stories disturb us, but we seek them out. We read them voluntarily, recommend them to friends, return to them repeatedly. Some psychological theories suggest that horror fiction serves an inoculating function, providing controlled exposure to frightening concepts in contexts where we remain safe. We practice encountering the unbearable while sitting in comfortable chairs. The practice doesn't make the concepts less frightening, but it does build a kind of tolerance, a capacity to contemplate terrible possibilities without being overwhelmed. Others have suggested that cosmic horror offers a strange form of comfort. The genre's central message is that human concerns don't matter on cosmic scales. This sounds bleak, and it is. But for people overwhelmed by the pressure to matter, to achieve, to justify their existence, the message might function as relief. Nothing you do will affect the vast, indifferent cosmos. You can stop trying. The insignificance that horrifies some readers liberates others. Climate change has made dimensional instability feel less fictional. The familiar environment is becoming unfamiliar. Weather patterns that sustained civilizations are shifting. Landscapes that seemed permanent are transforming. The ground, both literally and figuratively, is becoming less stable. Cosmic horror's vocabulary has migrated into environmental discourse because it captures something about how ecological collapse feels from inside. The dimension we call Earth is destabilizing, and we're watching it happen without being able to stop it. Virtual and augmented reality technologies literalize dimensional overlay. We increasingly occupy spaces where multiple realities coexist, where digital layers supplement physical environments, where presence becomes negotiable. The smartphone in your pocket is a window into another dimension, one that you enter and exit dozens of times daily. We're developing the habits of dimensional travelers, learning to navigate between realities with different rules, and we're doing it so quickly that we haven't fully registered the strangeness. Philosophy has genuinely grappled with the questions that cosmic horror dramatizes. What lies beyond human perception? How do we relate to a reality that exceeds our concepts? What is the status of knowledge in a universe that wasn't designed for knowers? These are not merely fictional provocations. They're open problems that serious thinkers continue to address. Cosmic horror translates them into narrative form, making abstract difficulties emotionally vivid. The final implication is perhaps the most uncomfortable. We don't know that our dimension is stable. We assume it is because it has seemed stable throughout recorded history. But recorded history is brief by cosmic standards. The rules that govern our space might be local, temporary, subject to revision without notice. We have no guarantee that the geometry of tomorrow will match the geometry of today. The unstable dimensions we've been examining might be mirrors rather than windows. They might show us where we already are,